They called her just a nurse. That's what everyone at Seattle General whispered, the way you whisper about things that don't matter. Katie Morrison moved through the trauma bays with the kind of quiet efficiency that made people forget to look at her. They didn't know her hands had held organs still beating in a field hospital 3,000 miles away. They didn't know what muscle memory lived in those scarred forearms. What happened next would remind them all exactly who they'd been standing next to all along. Katie arrived at Seattle General at 6 in the morning on a Thursday, the fluorescent lights already humming their electric hymn when she pushed through the ambulance bay doors. The antiseptic smell hit first, sharp, cold, sterile, the kind of smell that meant nothing bad had happened yet. Her shift wouldn't begin for another hour, but she always came early. Small ritual. Unnoticed, unremarkable routine. The kind of thing a person could hide inside forever if they were careful enough. She moved into Trauma Bay 3, the locker room corridor stretching behind her like a throat she had to swallow through. Her station was exactly as she'd left it. Equipment arranged with mathematical precision. A 14-gauge angiocath needle in its precise slot. The Level 1 rapid infuser sitting in the corner like a waiting monument. Everything had its place because Katie Morrison had learned long ago that chaos killed people. Chaos took lives. Katie took chaos and murdered it methodically, without fanfare, without anyone ever knowing she'd been the one holding the knife. Her locker door hung open. Inside, folded with military corners, sat a flag. Not displayed. Not mounted. Just folded, the way flags are folded at funerals, the way they're folded when someone dies and there's nothing left to hold except cloth and the memory of what used to fill it. The flag had come home from Kandahar with 17 other things in a cardboard box. She'd thrown away 16 of them. This one remained. Every day she opened her locker and saw it sitting there, pressed against the cold metal like a prayer nobody had answered. She picked up her crash cart inventory checklist. Straightforward work, methodical work, the kind of work that required no thought and all of her attention simultaneously. Ambu bag. Check. Defibrillator pads. Check. For drip stand with 3 bags of saline solution hanging like sleeping bats. Check. She moved through the equipment like she was running her hands over muscle memory, over the weight of 16 years compressed into a uniform that no longer existed and a rank that had been administratively erased from every system that mattered. By 8 o'clock, the hospital started breathing. Nurses changed shifts in the corridor, their voices bouncing off linoleum like they were practicing for someone who cared. Attendings drifted through, coffee cups held in one hand and tablet computers in the other, the whole apparatus of modern medicine carried like an old-fashioned walking cane. And then Dr. Mercer arrived. He came through the sliding doors with the kind of presence that required room to exist. Mid-50s, silver threading through his hair with the kind of purpose that suggested it had been professionally applied. His suit cost more than Katie made in 2 weeks, a designer fabric, the kind that moved like water when he walked. He carried a coffee cup from somewhere expensive and checked his phone with the mechanical devotion of a man who believed his time was currency and everyone else's was free. Mercer was the kind of doctor who'd never had to think about whether his hands could hold someone's still beating heart. He had a reputation, which meant he had allies. He had a title, which meant he had authority. He had a medical degree from Johns Hopkins and a fellowship in trauma surgery and 17 years at Seattle General, all of which meant he'd never once in his entire career had his judgment questioned by a nurse. Not once. Until 9:08 that morning. The code came in like a siren. 72-year-old male, acute cardiac event in the parking lot, compressions ongoing, ETA 2 minutes. The trauma bay erupted into that organized chaos that only looked like panic if you didn't understand the choreography. Katie was already moving toward the stretcher when Mercer came through the sliding doors, still holding his expensive coffee, his voice already sharp with that tone that meant he expected obedience and full attention. The patient rolled in on a stretcher. His face was the color of old paper. His chest was moving to the rhythm of someone else's hands, compressions being delivered by a paramedic whose face had that particular sheen of forced concentration that came from keeping someone dead from staying dead. Mercer took position at the head of the bed without asking anyone to move. People moved. Katie stayed where she was. She was the one who'd been monitoring the EKG, the monitor already tracking the electrical silence of a failing heart. Asystole. No rhythm. Nothing. Just the horizontal line that meant whatever animation had kept this man walking around was no longer interested in cooperating. She watched Mercer's hands move, watched him direct the code with the kind of automatic authority that came from years of being the smartest person in the room. Usually. He ordered epinephrine. 1 milligram 4. Katie was already moving toward the crash cart. She pulled the medication, verified the dose, held it up to Mercer like a question. He was already looking away, already barking the next order, already assuming her obedience was the baseline condition of existence. That's when she saw it. The drip calculation on the monitor. He'd ordered epinephrine at a dose that was 2.5 times what cardiac protocol required. The pause lasted 1 second. Not longer. Just long enough for Katie's brain to compute the simple mathematics of death. Too much epinephrine meant cardiac rupture. It meant the heart would beat so violently, so catastrophically, that it would literally tear itself apart. It meant this man would go from cardiac arrest to dead, the kind of dead where no one pretended there had ever been a chance to save him. Katie set the medication down on the crash cart and looked at Mercer directly. Her voice was very quiet. That's 2.5 milligrams. Protocol is 0.4. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze its mechanical rhythm in the next bay over. The paramedic's hands stopped moving. The nurse assisting froze mid-reach toward the fall line. Mercer's face traveled through a sequence of expressions that Katie had seen before, on men who'd been corrected in public and couldn't decide whether to murder someone or pretend it hadn't happened. He chose the third option. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that came with teeth. I'm aware of the protocol, Morrison. Dosage is lethal. I don't recall asking for your medical opinion. Katie picked up the correct dose from the medication drawer. 1 milligram. She held it out. She didn't lower her eyes. She didn't apologize. She didn't do any of the things that nurses were supposed to do when they'd just implied that the ER department head couldn't read his own medication protocol. She simply existed, holding out the correct medication, her scarred hand steady as a surgical laser, her presence somehow making the air pressure in the room change. Something flickered across Mercer's face. Not fear. He wasn't capable of fear. Something closer to the expression a man gets when he realizes he's encountered something he doesn't have a category for. He took the medication from Katie's hand without touching her skin. He administered the correct dose. 30 seconds later, the monitor registered a pulse. Weak. Inconsistent. But there. The man lived. Not because of Mercer's order. Because of Katie Morrison's correction, delivered in a voice that left no room for arguments or ego or the illusion that hierarchy meant knowing things. Mercer turned away before the monitor had registered 3 full heartbeats. He didn't thank Katie. He didn't acknowledge her in any way that suggested she'd just prevented him from killing a man in front of 12 witnesses. He simply walked out of the trauma bay with the practiced stride of someone who'd learned that if you move fast enough, maybe nobody remembers what you left behind. Katie restocked the crash cart. She replaced the medications. She returned the equipment to its precise location. Nobody spoke to her. The paramedic who'd been doing compressions caught her eye once and held it for a moment longer than necessary. Then he looked away. That was fine. Katie didn't need thanks. She didn't need recognition. She needed the man to live, and he had. That was information. That was all that mattered. By late morning, the rumors had already started their viral spread through the hospital. The way rumors do when they involve a challenge to authority and the possibility that someone with a title had almost made a lethal mistake. Katie heard them in the break room when she sat down to drink her coffee, and everyone stood up and left. She didn't flinch. She didn't respond. She simply sat there, nursing her drink, while the room evacuated around her like she carried some kind of contagion. She was finishing the last cold swallow when the ambulance siren started wailing again. Multiple units. That particular frequency that meant not just a call, but a transfer. Bring them in. We're inbound. A Navy SEAL, according to the radio chatter. 28 years old. Training accident. Multiple injuries. The kind of call that made the trauma team start moving even before the patient arrived, because Navy SEALs don't come in alive very often, and when they do, it's because the universe has decided to give you a problem that requires solving. Katie was already moving toward Trauma Bay 2 when the stretcher rolled through the ambulance bay doors. The SEAL was conscious, which meant he was either incredibly lucky or incredibly trained, or both. His left leg was bent at an angle that nature hadn't intended. His right arm was strapped to his chest. His face was the color of someone who'd lost blood and was running on adrenaline and the particular breed of stubbornness that only came from having survived things that were supposed to kill you. She was already assessing before the stretcher had come to a complete stop. Compound fracture, left femur. Possible brachial artery damage on the right side. Airway open. Breathing compromised but present. Her hands were already moving, already assessing, already feeding information through her fingers into the patient's condition and out again in the form of action. The SEAL's eyes opened. He was looking directly at Katie, and his voice was barely a whisper, the kind of whisper that comes from someone whose body is running on fumes and determination and nothing else. You move like you've done this before. Katie was already wrapping the pressure bandage around his right arm. Her hands moved with the rhythm of someone who'd performed this exact action hundreds of times, maybe thousands, in places where the alternative to speed was death. She didn't answer him. She simply pressed a finger to her lips, a gesture that meant both stay quiet and don't ask questions I can't answer. His eyes closed again, but not before Katie saw something shift in them. Some kind of recognition. Some kind of understanding. The kind of look that comes when someone has glimpsed the edge of something they're not supposed to know about and decided that whatever they'd seen, they would keep it to themselves. Katie worked. The 4-line went in smooth and efficient. The cardiac monitor came online. The oxygen saturation climbing steadily as his lungs found their rhythm again. 82%. 87%. 91%. She checked her work. Everything was correct. Everything was precise. Everything was built on muscle memory so deep that it had stopped being memory and started being simple biology. The SEAL's eyes remained closed, but his mouth twitched toward something that might have been a smile if he'd had the energy to actually make it happen. From the doorway, watching silently, Mercer's expression was impossible to read. The fluorescent lights hummed their steady electric hymn as Mercer stood at the nursing station, his surgeon's hands folded on the counter like a judge about to pronounce sentence. Katie had moved past him into the hallway, but he didn't follow. He didn't need to. What he needed was an audience, and Seattle General had plenty of them. By the end of that first week after the code, whispers had begun circulating through the break room like contagion. Charity case Katie. That's what Dr. Mercer called her when he thought no one important was listening, though he made sure someone always was. A medical student here, a resident there, always within earshot of the nursing station where gossip moved faster than fluids through a rapid infuser. I've been reviewing her credentials, he said to no one in particular, his voice pitched just loud enough. Something doesn't add up. 7 years as a trauma nurse, but no verifiable employment history before she came here. The lie was constructed with the precision of a surgeon's knot, not obviously false, just wrong enough to plant seeds. One nurse, Sarah, who'd trained Katie and trusted her completely, exchanged a glance with another RN. By lunchtime, doubt had taken root. By shift change, it had grown teeth. Katie sat alone in the break room on a Thursday afternoon, a salad she wasn't eating in front of her, when Sarah walked in with 2 other nurses. Their conversation stopped like a dropped scalpel. They gathered their things and left without acknowledging her. Not unkindly. Worse than unkind, professionally. The kind of silence that felt calculated, rehearsed. A medical student named Thomas, whom Katie had walked through his first major trauma case 6 months earlier, suddenly needed to use the bathroom whenever she appeared in a hallway. The break room chair across from her remained empty like an invisible barrier. She understood what was happening. She'd seen similar patterns in field hospitals, the way perception became reality when enough people stopped questioning it. The only difference was the weapon. Then it wasn't bullets. Now it was whispers. 3 weeks in, the formal write-up appeared on the unit board in the nursing station. White paper, official letterhead, Dr. James Mercer's signature at the bottom like a threat written in cursive. Repeated instances of insubordination and questionable judgment, it read. Nurse Morrison has demonstrated a pattern of overstepping her scope of practice and undermining physician authority during critical situations. The charges were vague enough to stick and specific enough to damage. Katie read it once, her face completely still, her jaw a single tightened line. Then she went back to charting. She didn't discuss it. She didn't defend herself. She simply continued working, her composure like armor plate, which somehow made it worse for everyone watching. Composure like that, unflinching, cold, impossible to rattle, suggested she wasn't actually bothered. And people found that more threatening than tears would have been. Charity case Katie, Mercer said that same afternoon, standing at the medication dispensary where several staff members were pulling supplies. Not to them. Just out loud, conversationally, as if he were commenting on the weather. One of the residents forced a laugh. No one corrected him. Katie was 2 corridors away, but the words moved faster than she did. By evening they'd made it to every unit in the hospital. Some people assumed she'd gotten hired through an affirmative action program. Others decided she must have falsified her resume. A few simply stopped trusting her entirely, their eyes tracking her movements during patient care with the kind of suspicion usually reserved for suspected malpractice cases. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when a Gold Star family arrived at Seattle General. Their son, a Navy SEAL named Marcus, had suffered cardiac complications during a training exercise at nearby Fort Liberty. He'd arrested twice in the ambulance. The family was terrified, mother with red-rimmed eyes, father with his jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscle working, younger sister gripping the father's sleeve like it was a life raft. Katie was preparing to lead the code team when Mercer appeared in the hallway outside Trauma 3, his timing too perfect to be accidental. The family was right there, standing in that grey zone between the waiting area and the actual medical space, watching everything. Nurse Morrison, Mercer said, his voice loud enough to carry but pitched as though he were speaking privately. Your performance yesterday concerns me. That dosage adjustment you made without consulting me first, that was inappropriate. His eyes were fixed on hers, but his posture was angled toward the family. Your judgment continues to be questionable. I wonder if we should be discussing whether you're qualified to be in leadership positions during critical codes. The father's protective arm tightened around his daughter. The mother's expression shifted from hope to doubt. It happened in real time, the seed taking root right in front of Katie, in front of the people she was about to save their son's life for. The room didn't go silent, monitors were beeping, alarms were sounding somewhere 3 rooms over, a ventilator wheezed its mechanical breath from a nearby bay. But the space between Katie and Mercer crystallized into something sharp and dangerous. She looked at him with the kind of stare that came from having stared down worse things in worse places. Not angry. Anger would have been small. This was colder. This was the look of someone who'd seen the absolute worst humanity had to offer and had decided some things simply weren't worth her emotional energy. The only questionable judgment here, Katie said, her voice steady as a metronome, each word measured and precise, is yours. That family just heard you prioritize your ego over their son's care. And he's not even your patient. She turned on her heel with the kind of finality that doesn't invite response. Her boots clicked against the tile floor, 1, 2, 3, 4, and she disappeared into Trauma 3. Behind her, Mercer's mouth opened and closed like a fish in a tank with no water. The Gold Star family stared at him. The father's grip on his daughter loosened slightly. The mother's jaw unclenched. What happened next moved with the precision of choreography. Katie entered the trauma bay where Marcus lay unconscious, pale as hospital sheets, and something shifted in her bearing. The careful deference she'd been performing, the one that said "I'm just a nurse, I defer to your authority," evaporated like morning frost. She pulled on sterile gloves with a sharp snap. She called out orders. A 12-lead EKG got initiated. Blood work went to the lab stat. The crash cart was positioned before she'd even finished speaking the instructions. The residents and medical students in the room, several of whom had heard Mercer's accusations, suddenly understood something that couldn't be articulated. This woman wasn't performing uncertainty because she felt it. She was performing it because the institutional structure required it. Marcus's heart rhythm changed on the monitor, atrial fibrillation, his rate climbing toward 160. A cardiologist was already being paged. The anesthesiologist was scrubbing in. Katie moved through the space like someone navigating a familiar landscape, her hands already reaching for supplies before her brain had consciously registered which ones she'd need. And went in on the first attempt, no hesitation, no second guessing. Her hands moved with the kind of muscle memory that only accumulates over thousands of procedures, and somewhere in the back of the trauma bay, a medical student watched those hands and wondered what in hell she actually was. By noon, Marcus was stabilized. His cardiac rhythm had converted to normal sinus after a carefully measured dose of amiodarone, and he was being moved to the cardiac care unit for monitoring and continued treatment. The family was escorted to a waiting area where they'd receive regular updates. Katie dictated her assessment notes with the same clinical precision she'd used to save their son's life. She didn't mention the hallway incident. She didn't file a complaint about Mercer's conduct. She simply returned to her other patients, her other codes, her other invisible rescues that would never make anyone's permanent record. But that wasn't the worst part of what was coming. Not really. That afternoon, Mercer sat in his office with the door closed, a phone pressed against his ear. On the other end was a contact at the state medical board, someone who owed him a favor from a golf outing 2 years prior. He had a nursing colleague with questionable credentials, he explained. Employment history that didn't check out. Scope of practice violations. A pattern of insubordination. Could they look into it? Just a routine credentialing review. Nothing formal yet, just, could they check? The contact promised he would. Then Mercer called hospital administration. Then the credentialing department. Then a friend at another teaching hospital who might know something about her background. The calls were strategic, calculated, and completely deniable. He was simply asking questions. Asking for verification. Raising concerns through proper channels. It was the kind of institutional sabotage that left no fingerprints because the entire system was designed to accept it. Meanwhile, Katie was unwrapping a sandwich in the break room when her personal cell phone buzzed. A voicemail notification. No caller ID. No name attached to the contact. She almost listened to it, her thumb hovering over the play button for exactly 2 seconds. Then she deleted it without hearing a word. She was through hoping that anyone had her back. Through believing that the truth would matter. Through expecting anything from the institutional machinery that ground on regardless of who it destroyed. The sandwich tasted like cardboard. She ate it anyway. The sandwich tasted like cardboard. She ate it anyway. Katie sat in the break room at 2:15 in the afternoon, the fluorescent panel above her desk humming its familiar dirge. Outside the small window, Raleigh's summer pressed against the glass like a living thing, heat shimmer rising off the parking lot in waves that made the asphalt look liquid. She'd been staring at her phone for the last 7 minutes. No voicemail. No texts. Just the weight of silence that felt heavier than any message could be. The intercom crackled. Code announcement, routine, someone's appendix going sideways in the surgical wing. She didn't move. Wasn't her department. Wasn't her problem anymore, or so Mercer wanted everyone to believe. The write-up had done its work and her nurses now rerouted when she entered a room, conversations died mid-sentence, and the break room had developed a gravitational field that pushed everyone away from her corner. 3 days of that. 3 days of watching her name become shorthand for fraud, incompetence, the woman who didn't belong. She bit down on the sandwich. Turkey and mustard. Tasted like nothing. At 2:47, the trauma alert came through. Not a routine alert. A cascade alert. The kind that made every head in the ER snap toward the overhead speaker like a neural synchronization, some primal recognition that the hospital was about to transform into something feral and necessary. Multiple traumas. Mass casualty. Construction site accident on North Ridge Drive. Partial building collapse. At least 8 patients incoming. ETA 8 minutes. Katie moved on instinct. The sandwich went into the trash. The break room emptied like someone had pulled a fire alarm. By the time she reached the ER corridor, the place had shifted, nurses running the supply inventory for trauma bays, residents being routed to stations, the whole machinery spinning up with the practiced urgency of people who'd done this 100 times before. She found her way to the board where shift assignments cascaded in the nurse coordinator's handwriting. Trauma 1, Sarah Nichols, Rebecca Huang, 2 of the hospital's best, both experienced with vascular work. Trauma 2, Marcus Wells, Janet Chen. Trauma 4, Lisa Rodriguez, Danny Park. Trauma 3 sat empty. No names. No assignment. Just waiting. Katie's jaw tightened. She knew what this was. She'd seen Mercer moving through the ER earlier, talking quietly to attendings, his hand resting on shoulders in that practiced way that made people listen. She'd assumed it was just more of the same, more positioning, more networking in his campaign to build the case for her termination. But this was smarter. This was calculated. The mass casualty was a gift, and he was about to weaponize it. She grabbed the radio clip to her pocket and keyed it. Dispatch, this is Morrison. I'm available for Trauma 3 assignment. Static. Then, copy that, Morrison. Trauma 3 is staffed. But it wasn't. The board didn't lie. She was standing right in front of it. The first ambulance wailed into the bay at 2:55. Katie moved toward Trauma 3 without being told, the muscle memory of emergency overriding everything else. The bay was prepped, crash cart positioned, monitors running their test cycles, the ventilator standing like a chrome sentinel in the corner. She was checking before setup when she heard the paramedics calling out vitals through the transport doors. Male, late 30s, steel rod impaled anterior chest, left of midline, approximately 4 inches below the left nipple. Blood loss significant. No conscious response. Heart rate 140 on scene, dropping to 92 en route. BP 108/60 and falling. The construction worker came through on the gurney like something broken, his chest wrapped in field dressings that were already soaked through. The paramedic was riding the stretcher, maintaining pressure, and he locked eyes with Katie for exactly 1 second before transferring the patient to her bay. That second contained a warning, this one's bad, his eyes said. This one's going to code. Get me 2 large bore lines, Katie called out, but when she glanced toward the bay opening, no one appeared. She repeated it, louder. 2 large bore lines. 14 gauge minimum. Nothing. Morrison. A voice from the observation window. Mercer, standing above the bay with his arms crossed, his face a study in calculated neutrality. I've assigned your usual team to the other traumas. You're solo this afternoon. We need all hands where they're most useful. There it was. The trap, laid out with surgical precision. A mass casualty meant every experienced trauma nurse was occupied. Every attending was elsewhere. And here in Trauma 3, she was alone with a man whose heart was already struggling, whose blood pressure was a whisper away from zero, whose only hope was skills that a trauma nurse was not supposed to possess. I need support, Katie said, her voice steady despite the electrical charge running through her nervous system. This patient needs a surgeon. Now. Surgeons are occupied, Mercer said. They'll be with you momentarily. Work with what you have. What she had was a medical student who'd wandered into the observation area wearing scrubs and the expression of someone who'd just realized that theories in textbooks bore no resemblance to actual human suffering. Katie recognized him, first year, name escaping her, the kind of pale that suggested his clinical rotation was going worse than anyone had planned. "You," she said. "Trauma 3. Now." He didn't move. The construction worker's monitor began to drift. O2 sat dropping, 98 down to 92. His heart rate climbing. The 4 started without his help wasn't going in. His veins were collapsing from the blood loss, from shock, from his body's desperate decision to shunt all available fluid toward the organs that might still matter. Katie worked the line herself, needle stick, find the vein despite the cold, unwilling skin, push through the dermis with the kind of confident aggression that you learn doing this for real instead of in simulation labs. The needle hit. Blood return. She taped it off and was already reaching for the fluid when the monitor showed it. Flat line. The construction worker's heart had made its decision. It wasn't doing this anymore. The student in the doorway made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. Katie pulled the crash cart close with one hand while her other hand was already moving. Scalpel from the tray. Rapid, efficient. No hesitation. The blade went in between the ribs, and there was a sound like a seal breaking, the hiss of air escaping from the thoracic cavity. Her hands moved through the opening with the kind of muscle memory that didn't come from nursing school, that came from doing this in the dust and blood of a forward operating base when there was no attending, no backup, just you and a dying man and the knowledge that the next 30 seconds would determine whether he saw sunrise again. "Move," she said to the student, her voice dropping an octave. Not a request. Not anymore. A command delivered with the flat certainty of someone who'd given them before and expected obedience. The student moved. He came to the table like someone waking from a dream, and when Katie looked at him, something in her expression activated whatever combat reflex lives in all of us, the primordial recognition of authority that doesn't come from a name tag or a paycheck but from the absolute certainty of someone operating in their element. "Clamp," she said. "Left hand. Now." He handed her the clamp. It went into the thoracotomy with precision, cross-clamping the descending aorta just below the left subclavian, the metal teeth gripping tissue with the kind of certainty that had kept soldiers alive in places where there were no hospitals, where the surgeon was whoever understood anatomy best and had the steadiest hands. "Suction," she said. He controlled the bleeding. His hand steadied as hers guided him, as her voice became the calm center of a storm. She was calling numbers. "What's the rhythm now?" And he was answering, agonal. And she was already knowing what that meant, was already moving to cardiac massage because sometimes when the heart stops, you have to restart it with your own hands, have to press the life back into something broken. 1 minute. 2. The monitor became a line, and then it began to move. Jagged. Irregular. But moving. The blood pressure flickering back, 60/40. 80/50. The heart finding something like rhythm, something like purpose. "We're getting him," Katie heard herself say, but the voice didn't sound like the voice that had ordered turkey and mustard 45 minutes ago. This voice came from somewhere older. Somewhere that had learned how to keep people alive in impossible circumstances. They packaged him fast. Transfer to OR, the attending finally arriving just in time to take the case away from her, his face registering something between surprise and confusion as he took in the scene. The student was pale, shaking slightly, but his hands had held instruments correctly, had followed orders without hesitation, had been useful in a way that would probably either break his medical school career or define it entirely. The construction worker went through the doors to surgery still alive. Still fighting. Katie stripped off her gloves. Her scrubs were soaked through blood, fluids, the unmistakable evidence of the kind of procedure that no trauma nurse should be able to perform with such brutal efficiency. She could feel her heart rate slowly dropping, the adrenaline leveling, the conscious mind beginning to reassert itself over the autonomic nervous system that had taken over her hands. And standing at the observation window, Dr. Mercer was watching her with an expression that had nothing to do with medical evaluation. His jaw was tight. His eyes held something like rage, but also something else. Something like recognition. Something like the terrible knowledge that Katie Morrison had just given him exactly what he needed to end her career, not because she'd failed, but because she'd succeeded in a way that made it absolutely clear she was something other than what she claimed to be. Mercer didn't wait for Katie to even strip off her gloves. He appeared in the trauma bay doorway with the expression of a man who'd just watched a bomb detonate perfectly on schedule. The patient was stable, breathing on his own now, sinus rhythm holding steady on the monitor above. But none of that mattered to him. "You just performed a surgical procedure without authorization," he said. His voice was quiet, controlled, the most dangerous kind of calm. That's grounds for immediate termination and criminal charges. Katie peeled off the bloody latex without looking at him, the sound of it like skin shedding. She didn't respond, didn't flinch. She simply held his gaze with that cold, flat stare that made hospital residents nervous, and moved to dispose of the gloves in the red biohazard container. The fluorescent lights above hummed their relentless frequency. He was already on his phone, his thumb moving across the screen with the precision of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Yes, this is Dr. Edmund Mercer from Seattle General. I need to file a formal complaint with the state medical board regarding a nurse practitioner who exceeded her scope of practice in a potentially lethal manner." His voice had the polish of rehearsal. He'd practiced this call. Probably written it down. Probably consulted hospital counsel. This wasn't a reaction. This was a strategy he'd been building since the moment she'd corrected his dosage calculation 3 months ago. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in institutional destruction. Katie didn't see it coming in real time. She was too busy finishing her shift, documenting the thoracotomy with surgical precision, answering questions from residents about field pressure techniques that she shouldn't have known. But the machinery of her erasure was already grinding. By the next morning, she was barred from the critical case board. A notice posted in the staff break room, her name removed from the rotation for trauma cases, reassigned to discharge paperwork and patient follow-up calls. Mercer had walked into the department head's office with printouts, employment gaps she couldn't explain without revealing classified operations, inconsistencies in her credential timeline that looked suspicious if you squinted, and a folder of her pattern of exceeding scope going back months. Every time she'd moved faster than protocol allowed. Every time she'd been right when she should have needed to wait for a doctor's order. He'd called the hospital's legal department. He'd called the state board. He'd called contacts he had at nursing oversight committees, weaving a narrative so carefully constructed it almost sounded true, a nurse with forged credentials, hiding something, dangerous, unstable. The gap in her employment history, the years she'd spent in Kandahar running field hospitals, the 3 tours, the classified operation that had ordered her off the record, he presented all of it as fabrication. As evidence of deception. The hospital's background check, ordered routinely for her credentialing renewal, started flagging inconsistencies. Her employment references didn't match her stated service timeline. Her military service records, when they pulled them, showed nothing. No Katie Morrison in any Medcom database. No captain. No Silver Star. No deployment records. To an ordinary background check investigator, it looked like she'd made it all up. Mercer's smile had the quality of a wolf's, all teeth, no warmth. He had her now. He had documentation. He had precedent. He had the hospital's fear of liability pushing him forward like wind at his back. 3 days after the thoracotomy, Katie was called to a conference room on the administrative floor. The kind of room designed to feel professional and neutral, all mahogany table and recessed lighting, the kind of room where careers went to die quietly. HR was there. Hospital counsel was there. 2 faces she didn't recognize from the compliance department. And Mercer sitting at the head of the table like a surgeon at his own operating theater. Katie, the HR director began, and Katie knew immediately that she was already gone. "We need to discuss some serious concerns that have come to our attention." Mercer presented his case with surgical precision. Every reassignment documented. Every instance of her stepping beyond protocol noted and timestamped. The patient outcomes were excellent, he didn't dispute that, but that almost made it worse in his narrative. She was operating at a level that suggested formal medical training she claimed she didn't have. The credential gaps. The employment inconsistencies. The mysterious 3-year period where she claimed military service but no records existed to prove it. "I filed reports with the state board," Mercer said. His hands were folded on the table, the picture of concerned professionalism. "And I have to tell you, they share my concerns about credential fraud. The question is whether this hospital wants to be liable for employing someone with forged qualifications." Katie listened. That was all she did. She listened with her jaw steady and her hands flat on the table, and she didn't defend herself because defending herself meant explaining Kandahar, meant explaining the classified operation, meant breaking her security oath. Mercer had chosen his weapon perfectly. He'd attacked her with the one thing she couldn't fight without destroying herself. Effective immediately, the hospital counsel said quietly, "You're suspended pending formal investigation into practicing beyond your scope of authorization. We'll need you to turn in your badge and credentialing materials." Katie stood. She didn't argue. Didn't protest. She simply walked out of the conference room and made her way down to the employee locker room on the 3rd floor, her hands steady as surgical instruments. Her locker was small. Most trauma nurses didn't accumulate much. A change of clothes. Some antiseptic wipes. Her stethoscope, a Littmann, good quality, practical. And at the bottom, beneath 2 pairs of backup scrubs, the folded flag. The one they'd given her when they told her that Captain Sarah Chen wasn't coming home from the classified operation. The one she'd been carrying in her locker for 2 years, never mentioning it, never explaining it, just keeping it close the way some people keep photographs of their children. She picked it up. It was heavier than a flag should be, heavier than the weight of fabric and stitching could account for. It carried the weight of names. Of decisions made in the dark. Of the price of being good at things that required being good at things you couldn't talk about. The drive to the all-night diner on the edge of Raleigh took 17 minutes. It was called Mel's, and it smelled like deep fryer grease and stale coffee and the particular loneliness that only fluorescent lights at 3 in the morning could generate. There were 3 other people inside, a trucker reading a newspaper, an older woman who might have been a night shift nurse or might have been coming down off something, and a kid with headphones in, nursing a single cup of coffee like it was a religious experience. Katie ordered coffee she didn't want and sat in a booth by the window. The Formica table was sticky. Her reflection in the dark glass was ghost pale, the kind of white that came from too many nights without sleep, too many decisions made in combat medicine, too many moments of choosing between protocols and human beings and usually choosing right when choosing right meant stepping outside the lines society had drawn for you. She stared at her own face in that window like it belonged to a stranger. 23 years ago, she'd joined the army because she wanted to save lives. 12 years ago, she'd been a trauma surgeon in a field hospital north of Kandahar when the classified operation came through, a black site extraction they never officially ran, a mission that never officially existed, a team that had been officially erased from all records when it was over. They told her she was too visible after that. Too known. Too compromised. They'd given her a new identity, a nursing credential, a placement at a civilian hospital, and an order to never speak about the other life. She'd done it. She'd put on scrubs instead of combat gear. She'd saved lives with sterile technique instead of a field knife. She'd been invisible for 2 years, just another competent nurse in a sea of competent healthcare workers. But invisibility only worked if nobody saw you. And the moment the construction worker's chest had been opened in Trauma 3, the moment her hands had moved through that thoracotomy with the fluid, terrible grace that came from having done it 43 times in conditions that would have broken most surgeons, the moment she'd proven she was something other than what she claimed to be, invisibility was impossible. She'd disappeared twice now. Once by order. Once by choice. And both times it had cost her everything. The phone in her scrub pocket buzzed. She pulled it out. Unknown number. DC area code. 5 missed calls. Messages left in a voicemail she'd never retrieved because the voice on the other end of federal communications was usually the one telling you that something had gone wrong, that your career was ending, that the past was reaching forward to pull you under. She opened the voicemail folder. Hit delete on all 5 without listening. She couldn't afford to know what they wanted. Couldn't afford to answer. Couldn't afford to surface. The military had ordered her gone, and she'd gone. That was the deal. That was the cost of what she'd done in Kandahar. The coffee in her cup had gone cold. The reflection in the window was still hers, still ghost pale, still carrying the weight of 2 lives collapsed into one impossible shape. Outside, the rain had started. Steady. Patient. The kind of rain that could last forever. She was going to disappear again. Pack a bag. Leave Raleigh. Leave Seattle General. Leave the nursing credential and the comfortable invisibility. Start over in some other city with some other name, the way people did when the past caught up with them. The way she'd done it before. But first, she was going to sit here in this diner at 3 in the morning with her cold coffee and her dead phone and her folded flag, and she was going to accept that some people aren't built for staying. Some people are built for vanishing. Some people carry too much history to ever really be still. The rain hammered against the window like applause. The hospital's routine background check hit a classified database at 2:24 p.m., 5 hours after Katie had emerged from the reinstatement hearing with her record still suspended, her future still fractured. The security clearance wasn't flagged because it was old, it was flagged because it was real. Buried. Compartmentalized. The kind of classified status that doesn't exist on official documents, only in Pentagon servers that most hospital administrators will never even know exist. The administrative conference room at Seattle General went quiet when the 2 Pentagon liaisons walked through the door in dress uniforms, their presence alone transforming the space the way a loaded gun changes the temperature of a room. Hospital administration froze. Dr. Mercer's lawyer leaned forward. Katie sat motionless in a plastic chair, her hands folded in her lap, watching the door with the calm of someone who had already lived through worse. Behind the liaisons, wheeled by an orderly, came the Navy SEAL she had saved 5 months earlier during his initial cardiac event, the routine code that hadn't been routine at all. He looked whole now. Stronger. His eyes found hers immediately, and something shifted in his expression, a recognition that moved across his face like a storm front. "Phantom," he said. His voice carried the gravel of someone who'd spent years in desert wind. "That's what they called you in Kandahar. I knew it the moment I opened my eyes on your trauma table. Nobody does a running stitch like that unless they've done it in a firefight." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator humming in the background. Dr. Mercer stood up, his face flushed red, his jaw working like a man choking on something poisonous. "This is absolute theater," he spat. "Some kind of manufactured." A Marine Corps liaison stepped forward with a file folder that looked official enough to carry weight. His voice cut through the room like a blade through sterile field. Captain Katie Morrison, 23 years of service, Silver Star recipient, commanded a forward surgical team in Kandahar province that sustained a 93% save rate under sustained enemy fire. He paused, letting each medal drop like a stone into still water. Bronze Star. Pause. Additional Bronze Star. Pause. 2 Purple Hearts. The longest pause. Navy Cross. Mercer lunged forward. "This is forged. All of it. I contacted federal authorities weeks ago about her fraudulent credentials. I have documented." The FBI agent who entered behind the Marine Corps liaison didn't interrupt him. He just shook his head at Mercer with the expression of someone observing a mosquito at the moment it becomes a problem requiring attention. When the second agent moved forward with handcuffs, Mercer finally understood. The forgeries he'd so carefully commissioned to prove Katie was lying, the false documents he'd paid for through intermediaries, the crude military records he'd doctored in a panic to discredit her, had tripped federal alarms the moment they touched Department of Defense servers. Dr. Harold Mercer, the FBI agent said, his voice the color of concrete. "You're under arrest for falsifying federal military documents, conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States government, and harassment under the color of institutional authority." The handcuffs went on with a sound like doors closing. Mercer's face went the color of old bone. They walked him out through the hallways of Seattle General the way all criminals walk, in the middle of two federal agents, his wrists cuffed behind his back, his designer shoes clicking against the linoleum in a rhythm that sounded like a funeral march. The nurses he'd poisoned against Katie stood frozen at their stations. Dr. Patterson, who'd listened to his whispers and started avoiding Katie in the break room, watched with her mouth open. The medical student who'd told Katie her credentials seemed suspicious because Mercer had told her to, turned away, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The Gold Star family whose son had been in the ICU, whose father Mercer had used as a prop to humiliate Katie in front of their grieving eyes, they stood in the corridor. The father, a man whose grief had been manipulated like a weapon, made deliberate eye contact with Mercer and turned his back. The gesture carried more weight than any words ever could. Mercer shuffled past. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone. Nobody spoke. The Marine Corps liaison finished reading from Katie's citation in the administrative conference room while Mercer was still being processed 3 floors down. The evacuation numbers. The surgical save rates that had become legendary in certain circles. The personal cost of living erased, name redacted, service classified, identity subsumed into the machinery of national security. Every sacrifice she'd made, quantified and authenticated by the Pentagon itself. Katie sat perfectly still. When the liaison finished, he nodded at her with the respect of one military professional acknowledging another. Hospital administration looked as though they'd been punched in the sternum. The Navy SEAL spoke again, his voice steady. "You saved my life twice. Once in Kandahar when an IED collapsed my lung, and again here when my heart gave out. You looked at me after you stabilized me in Kandahar and you said, 'The ones who have seen the worst often give the most.' I never forgot those words. I've lived by them for 23 years. He paused. I wanted you to know that I became a medic because of you. Because I watched Captain Katie Morrison choose service over survival, and I couldn't do anything less." Katie's expression didn't change, but something crystallized behind her eyes. She nodded once. A single gesture that contained everything the words couldn't. The Pentagon liaison extended his hand to Katie with formal precision. "Your security clearance is restored. Your medical license is reinstated with full back pay dating to your suspension. Your service record is unsealed for hospital verification only. Your classification remains intact, but Seattle General Administration is now aware of your true credentials." He paused. "You've been offered the position of Director of Trauma Services, effective immediately. You would report directly to the Chief Medical Officer." Katie stood. Shook his hand. Her voice, when it came, had dropped an octave from the deferential tone she'd maintained through weeks of humiliation. "I'll need operational autonomy. New protocols. And I want the medical student from Trauma 3 assigned to me for a year of field training." She looked at the hospital administrator. "Non-negotiable." "Of course," the administrator said quickly, the way people agree to demands from federal agencies and the Pentagon combined. The nurses who'd shunned her approached Katie afterward in the administrative corridor. Dr. Patterson said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know." Dr. Chen said, "Can we talk?" The med student from Kandahar, the one who'd frozen during the emergency thoracotomy, asked if Katie would teach him. "Teach you what?" Katie asked. "How to survive," he said. Katie considered this for 7 seconds. Then nodded. 6 months later, Seattle General's trauma department looked like a different institution. The break room that had emptied when Katie sat down now hummed with residents and nurses seeking her guidance on cases, asking her opinion, rotating through shifts that she'd restructured to eliminate the isolated coverage that had made her vulnerable to Mercer's sabotage. The unit board that had displayed her write-up now showcased protocol improvements she'd implemented. Save rates in her department had climbed by 18%, a number that had started circulating through hospital administration like currency. The folded flag from her fallen teammate no longer lived hidden in a locker. It sat in a shadow box in her office, mounted beside her Silver Star and Navy Cross, visible to anyone who entered. No more secrets. No more erasure. Katie Morrison was being paged for a code blue in the ICU when she saw the medical supply van pull up to the ambulance bay. She watched from the window as Dr. Harold Mercer climbed out wearing a contractor uniform, carrying boxes of gauze and 4 supplies. His hair had gone entirely grey. His shoulders had collapsed inward, as though the weight of his own actions had become physical. When he looked up and saw Katie standing at the window of Seattle General, the institution he'd once ruled through calculated cruelty, his entire body went rigid. She held the ambulance bay door open as he approached, his eyes fixed on the floor tiles, his face flushed with shame that no apology could touch. Katie said nothing. Didn't nod. Didn't gesture. Just stood there holding the door open while he shuffled past like a ghost moving through a world that no longer recognized him. The silence between them was the color of everything he'd tried to destroy and failed. He set the boxes down at the loading dock and left without another word. Katie released the door and moved back toward the ICU, her team already assembling around her. The medical student, the one who'd frozen and then learned, was already prepping medications, his hand steady, his confidence built on the foundation of what Katie had taught him. She guided him through the resuscitation with a calm voice that carried the weight of 23 years and counting. Sinus rhythm returned at 2 minutes of compressions. The patient's oxygen saturation climbed, 82, 88, 94. Stable. In her office afterward, Katie found the Navy SEAL waiting with coffee. He'd been visiting quarterly, still serving active duty, still shaped by the same code that Katie lived by. They sat in silence for 8 minutes. Neither of them needed to speak. When he left, he placed a challenge coin on her desk beside the shadow box containing the folded flag. A resident approached asking about the Kandahar running stitch. Katie picked up a suture kit and demonstrated, her hands moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd learned these skills in conditions where a trembling hand meant someone died. "Where did you learn that?" the resident asked. Katie paused, glanced at the shadow box, and said simply, "The ones who have seen the worst often give the most." She didn't elaborate. The legend was already written in the protocols that bore her name, in the save rates that climbed every quarter, in the nurses who no longer shunned quiet competence and started honoring it instead. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated, ever seen quiet strength overlooked until the moment it saved everything, subscribe to the Code Whisperers for more stories of hidden warriors walking among us. Like this video and drop a comment. Have you ever discovered that someone you thought you knew was carrying a history far greater than you imagined? Let's hear your stories.